So you all have a graphing rules packet in front of you. The packet really is saying these are rules that we have to follow anytime you're asked to make a graph. So these are your mental notes that you go through, a mental checklist. And I want you to follow along with me as I kind of go over some things. The first thing is, if I ask you to make a graph, you're going to put a title on that graph, and it's going to very specifically show what the graph is portraying. A lot of times people run into trouble with graphs because they try to make them like short and cute and clever. They're graph titles. Don't do that. If you look at a graph title from a scientific journal, for instance, they could be 3-4 lines long. Okay? They need to be long and detailed. And there's a formula that you can use. Anytime you're asked to make a title for a graph, the first thing you do is identify what information is shown on the y-axis. Relate it then to the x-axis. Okay? It could be as simple as that, but if you have more than one line, then you have to sort of relate and explain why you have more than one line, explain what's being shown there, and then there might be some other important information that you have to show. It really depends on the graph, and we'll look at some specific examples of that, but there's your general formula. Okay. Second thing is that good graphs have labeled x and y axes. Okay, so in addition to a title, the next thing is, did I label my axes? Don't forget, you have to have units of measurement shown there. Okay, then you have to set up a constant scale on each axis. Okay, what that means is it's similar to if you have your y and your x-axis. Sometimes I will have people who will put, like, if you have a data set and you have to graph it and it goes 2, 4, 6, 8, and then it'll go 12, 30, 90, and it's the same amount there. You can't do that. It's essentially like what you have to look at is if you put a ruler up against your graph, every block has to be worth the same amount. And then you plot your points wherever they fall on that ruler, and that's what you're going to end up with as a good graph. You have to also figure out how much you need. You can't just like tape extra paper on at the end because you didn't plan it out ahead of time. So you have to plan what you're doing. Okay. The next thing is number 4, use the right kind of graph. Bar graphs are used only if you're comparing distinct groups of data. So say, for instance, you were looking at the population of spotted lanternflies in August of every year, okay? And you had a graph set up, and you're looking at August of 2019, or 2014, and August of 2015, and August 2016. Well, you'd put a bar in there because you don't really care about the information in between August of one year and August of the next year, okay? So that makes sense to show a bar graph. Well, we don't want to do that because most of the time we really care about what's happening in between. So we're going to show a line graph because we'll have points on our line graph, and we're looking at what are the trends that are happening in that line graph. So that's for continuously changing data, and that's more often what we're going to use. Number 5, your manipulated variable or time always goes on the x-axis. Okay, this is your x-axis here, and the data that you record, the responding variable, always goes on the y-axis. You probably don't quite know what manipulated and responding variables are yet, but just remember D for data, okay? D has a vertical line on it, so the data that they recorded goes on the vertical axis. Why is that important? Well, let's say you make a graph, and if your graph ever goes forward and back, well, that means you switched your axes. You haven't switched to the wrong place, because graphs never go forward and back. They should always go kind of like in an up and down direction like this. They should always go up and down. But sometimes you don't have a graph that changes like that. Sometimes your graph might be where it's going to go up like this. And if you happen to switch your axes by accident, your graph will end up looking like this, which is really hard to tell the difference without knowing that you switched your axes. So what you have to remember is the data that they collected at the end of their experiment always goes on the y-axis. Okay? All right, so now we're going to scroll on down here a little bit, looking at the next couple. Number 6, if you use more than one line on your graph, you need a colored key. So let's say that's your graph axes, and you have one line that looks like this. And then why do we plot 2 different lines on the graph? Because we want to see the relationship between them. So let's say your other line goes like that. Well, see how I use 2 different colors? That's why I told you to get different colored pencils. So you can make those when you're at home if you need to. If you don't have 2 different colored pencils at home, that doesn't mean you can't do the lab. What you can do is, if you only have one color, you have one single line that looks like this, while your other line could be a dotted or a dashed line. Or maybe when you plot the points, you could make, different shaped points for each point. So one might just have dots and another one might have triangles. So there's different ways around that. And if you don't have graph paper, you can look up graph paper on the internet and you can print out pieces of graph paper. Or you could use Microsoft Word and make a table that has a whole bunch of spaces in it, and you can kind of make your own graph paper that way. Okay, so that's all important. Last thing is use at least 75% of the available space. So let's say, for instance, I give you a piece of paper that's this big, and I say, graph this data for me. A lot of times I'll get people that will make a graph like this big, and it's really hard to see what's going on because it's tiny and it's in a little tiny space. No, fill up 3/4 of the available space. For the lab that you're for this assignment, you're not going to be using the entire paper. You're going to be folding your paper, and your substitute teacher will show you how that's going to work. So you'll fold it in half, and you'll have 3 graphs to make. So you'll make your graphs in different panels there. Okay, so that's the first page. That's your general rules that you need to follow. If you look at the second page, you don't have to do anything on this page. This is instructions that if for some assignments I might say you can make this graph on the computer if you want, or you can make it by hand. If you want to make it on the computer using Microsoft Excel, here's your instructions for how to do that. So you can go ahead and do that. Okay, you don't have to do anything with that right now. And there's another website you can look at the bottom that will help you graph stuff if you need to. The third page is all about biomes. So you're going to have to read through this information. It has descriptions of different biomes. We defined that word already. And you'll see how the different biomes relate to one another. And you need that information to answer the questions on the next 3 pages. So if you turn to the next page, you have a single line graph that you have to analyze and answer these questions to it. Turn to the next page, there's a double line graph. Okay, I've changed some of the points into triangles on the wolf graph line so you can see that that's what it is. But you'll answer these questions based on that graph. If you turn to the next page, you have a bar graph to analyze. Now, on your copy, it bled through a little bit, so there's some dots at the top from when I did that on the previous page. Just ignore those. So you answer questions here based on that bar graph. Okay? And then the last part is you have 3 different graphs to make. The first one, you're going to have 2 lines on that graph, and then you have some questions to answer about it. The second one, read your instructions. You're going to calculate the percentage here, and then you're going to graph that percentage versus temperature, okay? And then answer a couple questions about it. And the last one, you have 3 different lines to graph on there, and then answer questions about that. Okay, so that's your graphing rules project or paper. That is your homework that is due on Tuesday. Enjoy.